My boss told me I was too old for this job and fired me on a Tuesday morning. 3 days later, Sterling Financial Solutions lost $40 million and filed for bankruptcy. I had spent 12 years building their financial platform from the ground up. Every line of code, every security protocol, every backup system came from my hands. The platform managed $1.2 billion for pension funds, children's hospitals, and veteran organizations across Texas. Perfect uptime for 12 years. Zero security breaches, zero lost data. My name is David Connor. I am 42 years old, and until last week, I was the lead database architect at Sterling Financial Solutions in Dallas. Before that, I worked for the NSA for 8 years, designing secure communication systems for military operations. I left government work after the Snowden revelations made me question who I was really serving. Robert Sterling hired me when his company was just 15 employees in a converted warehouse. He was different then. Hungry, focused, willing to work 18-hour days building something revolutionary. We were going to create a financial platform that could handle alternative investments while maintaining perfect security compliance. Sterling Financial specialized in managing assets for institutions that big Wall Street firms ignored. Teacher pension funds from small Texas towns, veteran organizations that pooled disability payments for group investments, children's hospitals that needed to grow their endowment funds, regional credit unions that wanted investment services but lacked technical infrastructure. These weren't billion-dollar hedge funds. These were regular people who had trusted us with their life savings. Teachers who had paid into pension funds for 30 years. Disabled veterans who had pooled government benefits for their children's education. Cancer patients whose families organized fundraising campaigns. Every dollar represented someone's dreams, someone's future, someone's last hope. Those early years felt like family. Sterling would buy barbecue for the whole team when we hit milestones. He knew everyone's names, everyone's kids' names. When my father died, Sterling gave me 3 weeks paid leave without question. He even attended the funeral, standing in the back row with tears in his eyes. The platform grew steadily through word of mouth. We landed our first major contract with the East Texas Teachers Retirement Fund, managing $400 million for educators across 53 school districts. Veteran organizations in Houston and San Antonio started using our services. The Children's Hope Cancer Center in Dallas became our most important client, trusting us with their $180 million endowment fund. By last year, we were managing assets for clients across the entire South. The platform I had designed handled real estate investments for pension funds, managed art portfolios for hospital endowments, and tracked precious metal holdings for veteran organizations. Every transaction was secured with military-grade encryption adapted from NSA protocols. Every backup was tested monthly using procedures I had developed for protecting classified information. But success changed everything. Sterling hired executives from Wall Street who wore expensive suits and talked about maximizing shareholder value. The converted warehouse became a gleaming office tower in downtown Dallas. The barbecue nights disappeared. Sterling started traveling more, delegating more, trusting spreadsheets instead of personal relationships. Michael Thornton was the worst of the new hires. He had worked for Goldman Sachs for 10 years, specializing in operational efficiency, corporate speak for cutting costs and increasing profits. He spoke in buzzwords and treated our regional clients like inconveniences. I watched him take calls from teacher pension fund managers while obviously checking his email, giving them the impression that their concerns weren't important enough for his full attention. Emily Sterling had been around the office since high school, working summer internships that mostly involved filing paperwork. She was smart enough: Harvard economics degree, solid grades, internships at prestigious New York firms. But she had never shown real interest in the technical side of our business. During college, she had focused on ESG investing and sustainable finance, topics that looked good on resumes but had little practical application to managing databases and securing financial transactions. She spent her junior year in London, interning at a sustainable investment fund. The experience gave her confidence but no understanding of the technical infrastructure required to protect client assets. Last month, things started feeling different. Sterling would walk past my office without stopping for our usual chats. In meetings, he would ask other people to explain decisions I had made. During weekly staff meetings, Sterling would call on Michael or Emily to provide updates on projects I was managing. Then came the questions about documentation. Michael explained that institutional knowledge could not live in just one person's head. We needed comprehensive documentation to ensure business continuity. I had documented everything thoroughly for years, but something about the way they asked made me wonder who would be reading those documents. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during a routine security update. I discovered a vulnerability in one of our client interfaces. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough to require immediate attention. I fixed it in 30 minutes, ran diagnostics, and verified that all client data remained secure. Sterling called me into his office the next day with an expression I had never seen before. Cold, formal, distant. He said we needed to talk about protocol. When I made changes to the system, even small ones, I needed approval first. The company had grown beyond informal structure. I explained it was a security patch addressing an immediate vulnerability. Waiting for approval would have left us exposed for hours while the bureaucratic process worked through management layers. Sterling said Emily had raised concerns about unauthorized modifications to critical systems. Emily had raised concerns about a security fix on a system she couldn't even access. She had never written a line of code, never managed a database, never dealt with protecting client assets from cyber threats. But she was questioning my judgment about security protocols I had designed and maintained for over a decade. That was when I knew they weren't planning to work with me. They were planning to replace me. I started making my own preparations that afternoon, using skills learned during my NSA years. I had built something into our system years ago during a particularly intense SEC audit. I called it Sanctuary, a distributed backup system that would protect client assets if the main system ever detected a massive unauthorized takeover attempt. The logic was simple but elegant, based on protocols I had developed for protecting classified information. If someone without proper biometric authorization tried to modify core database structures, the system would interpret it as a hostile takeover attempt. Rather than allow client funds to be compromised, Sanctuary would automatically transfer all assets to protected accounts in federal banks, where they would remain safe until proper authorization could be verified. The system had been carefully designed to distinguish between competent administrators and dangerous amateurs. It monitored keystroke patterns, the sequence of commands, and most importantly, whether users ignored security warnings or attempted to bypass safety protocols. Experienced database administrators worked methodically, testing each change before proceeding. Amateurs made multiple modifications simultaneously without understanding the consequences. Sanctuary also tracked behavioral patterns that indicated incompetence, disabling security features without understanding their purpose, attempting to simplify complex regulatory compliance systems, and making changes during peak hours without proper testing. When it detected these patterns, especially from users without proper biometric authorization, the protection protocols would activate. The transfer system wasn't theft. It was a legitimate emergency procedure I had established with federal banking authorities. When client assets were threatened by unauthorized system modifications, Sanctuary would move all funds to government-protected accounts. Recovering the money required extensive documentation proving the threat had been resolved and qualified personnel were managing the systems. The beauty of Sanctuary was its invisibility. I had embedded its components throughout the regular code base, disguised as routine backup and maintenance procedures. To anyone examining our systems, it appeared to be nothing more than comprehensive data protection protocols. Even experienced administrators wouldn't recognize it unless they knew exactly what to look for. The system used biometric authentication, behavioral analysis, and administrative pattern recognition to identify legitimate versus illegitimate access attempts. It monitored not just who was accessing the system, but how they were using it. The timing of actions, sequence of commands, types of modifications being attempted. I had installed Sanctuary during those early paranoid days when we handled sensitive government pension contracts and were constantly worried about corporate espionage or cyber attacks. The logic was sound. Better to temporarily lock everything down than let it fall into wrong hands. Originally, I had planned to disable those protocols before leaving the company. Clean shutdown, safe transition, no problems for anyone. But that was before I discovered they had been planning to eliminate me for months. The email arrived on a Thursday morning. Subject line, Organizational Restructuring, Confidential. The message was brief and corporate. Effective immediately, Sterling Financial would be implementing leadership changes in the technology division. David Connor would be transitioning from his current role to provide consulting support during a knowledge transfer period. Emily Sterling would assume responsibilities as Chief Technology Officer. I read it twice, then checked the access logs. They had already created new credentials for Emily, giving her administrative privileges she had not earned and did not understand. Root-level access to systems that controlled $1.2 billion in client assets. 12 years of 70-hour weeks. 12 years of perfect uptime. 12 years of building something that generated hundreds of millions in revenue. And they were handing it over to someone who had never written a line of production code in her life. But I was curious about the timing. Why now? So I started investigating. I had administrative access to all company systems, including email servers and file shares that contained strategic planning documents. I noticed something odd in the server logs. Someone had been accessing administrative functions at unusual hours. Late nights, early mornings, weekends. The credentials belonged to Michael Thornton. His access level should not have included core database modules. For the past 8 weeks, Michael had been creating detailed architectural maps of our entire system. Not just high-level overviews, but deep technical documentation that included security protocols, backup procedures, and fail-safe mechanisms. The kind of documentation you would create if you were planning to completely replace the person who built the infrastructure. But there was more. I found email chains between Michael and an outside consulting firm called Meridian Global. They had been discussing legacy system modernization and personnel transition strategies. The emails went back 4 months. I kept digging. Purchase orders for new hardware to replace infrastructure I had designed. Meeting notes discussing succession planning and reducing single points of failure. Budget projections showing significant cost savings from eliminating experienced technical staff. Single points of failure. That was what they called me in their internal documents. The worst discovery came when I accessed the executive file server. Hidden in a subfolder marked Strategic Planning 2024 inches was a PowerPoint presentation titled Database Operations Transition. It was dated 8 weeks ago and marked Confidential, Board Eyes Only. The presentation laid out their entire plan. Phase 1. Document existing systems. Phase 2. Engage external resources for modernization. Phase 3. Implement leadership transition. Phase 4. Retire legacy architecture and personnel. Slide 12 made everything crystal clear. Estimated annual cost savings from personnel reduction, $180,000. My salary. They weren't bringing in Emily because she had fresh ideas. They were eliminating me because they could pay Emily half my salary and pocket the difference. The technical complexity didn't matter to them. The 12 years of perfect uptime didn't matter. The hundreds of millions in revenue that flowed through systems I had built, none of it mattered compared to saving money on payroll expenses. Slide 17 showed projected cost savings over 5 years. $2.3 million from personnel reductions, $800,000 from infrastructure consolidation, $1.1 million from automated processing. They were planning to gut the entire technical team and replace us with off-the-shelf software solutions. Slide 18 showed a risk assessment matrix that rated various threats to their transition plan. Technical sabotage by departing personnel was listed as a low-probability, medium-impact risk. They had considered the possibility that I might try to disrupt their plans, but dismissed it as unlikely. The matrix was laughably naive. They had evaluated threats like data corruption due to user error as high probability and external cyber attacks as medium probability. But the idea that someone with my level of system access might have built-in protections against exactly this kind of corporate betrayal, low probability. They had run financial models showing best-case and worst-case scenarios for their transition plan. The worst case they had considered was a temporary delay in operations while Emily learned the systems. They projected maybe a week of reduced efficiency, possibly some minor client complaints. The idea that their entire operation could be automatically locked down by the very systems they were trying to steal never occurred to them. I could see Sterling's fingerprints all over this analysis. He had always been the type of CEO who believed that employees were essentially interchangeable parts. In his mind, technical expertise was just another commodity that could be bought and sold. The possibility that someone might have anticipated his betrayal and prepared accordingly was beyond his comprehension. They had underestimated me completely. I printed the presentation and walked to my car. They had been incredibly thorough in documenting every system I managed, every process I had created, every security protocol I had implemented. But they had missed something crucial. The documentation they had compiled was actually impressive in its scope. Michael Thornton and his consultants had mapped out our entire database architecture, identified every server, cataloged every backup procedure. They had screenshots of admin panels, flowcharts showing data relationships, even estimates of how long each process took to execute. What they hadn't found was the shadow architecture that existed alongside the documented systems, the monitoring processes that looked like routine maintenance scripts, the data validation procedures that appeared to be simple backup checks, the communication protocols that seemed to be regulatory compliance tools. They had documented the systems I had built, but they had not found the systems I had hidden. Emergency protocols buried deep in the core framework, fail-safe mechanisms that wouldn't show up in any standard audit, security measures I had installed during those paranoid early days. These weren't backdoors or malicious code. They were legitimate security measures designed to protect client assets from unauthorized access. The fact that Sterling's team couldn't distinguish between the visible infrastructure and the hidden protection systems proved exactly why those protections were necessary. I had built those systems to protect the company from external threats, corporate espionage, cyber attacks, hostile takeovers. I had never imagined the threat would come from inside, from the very people who were supposed to be protecting our clients' interests. But the beautiful thing about well-designed security protocols is that they don't distinguish between external and internal threats. They just identify unauthorized access attempts and respond according to their programming. The knowledge transfer meeting was scheduled for Monday. I arrived 15 minutes early and set up in Conference Room B. Emily showed up 20 minutes late, carrying a large coffee and talking loudly on her phone about weekend plans. Her entrance perfectly embodied everything wrong with Sterling's decision. While I was setting up documentation about systems that protected billions of dollars in assets, she was complaining to someone about how boring her weekend in the Hamptons had been. She ended the call with a laugh about how she was about to become like a tech CEO or whatever. She sat across from me and pulled out a brand new MacBook Pro, still wrapped in plastic. She asked where we should start, as if we were about to review a restaurant menu rather than discuss systems that protected the life savings of thousands of families. I started with basics, explaining that our platform managed financial data for 47 major clients. She nodded along occasionally, but I could tell she was lost by the third slide. The concepts I was explaining, database normalization, transaction logging, backup redundancy, were completely foreign to her. Every few minutes, she would interrupt with questions that revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what we did. She asked why we needed so many different databases when everything could just go in one big file. She wondered why we bothered with encryption since our clients trust us anyway. She suggested that maybe we could just use Excel for the smaller accounts. These weren't the questions of someone trying to understand a complex system. These were the suggestions of someone who thought database management was essentially advanced bookkeeping. Halfway through the morning, she interrupted to say it seemed pretty complicated. Didn't I think we could simplify everything? Maybe use cloud storage instead of these outdated local servers? Cloud storage for $1.2 billion worth of regulated financial data. I explained that the current architecture met all federal compliance requirements. Moving to cloud infrastructure would require 18 months of regulatory approval and cost approximately $40 million. She made a note. Look into cloud options, potential cost savings. Around noon, she said she thought she was getting the hang of everything. It was basically like managing a really big Excel spreadsheet, right? I stared at her. A $1.2 billion financial platform that handled complex investment transactions, regulatory compliance, and real-time security monitoring was basically like a really big Excel spreadsheet. Not exactly, I said. She said she had ideas about modernizing our approach. Maybe we could use artificial intelligence to automate boring tasks. She had read about blockchain technology that might be more secure than our current setup. I explained that we had been using machine learning algorithms for 3 years. As for blockchain, implementing that would require rebuilding our entire infrastructure from scratch, obtaining new regulatory approvals, and retraining all clients. The project would take 2 years minimum and cost tens of millions. She made another note. Resistance to innovation. Potential personnel issue. That afternoon, Sterling called me into his office. Emily was already there, looking upset. Sterling said Emily had concerns about the morning's training session. She felt like I was being deliberately obtuse, making things more complicated than necessary. I explained that the system was complex because it handled complex operations involving billions of dollars and strict regulatory requirements. I couldn't make federal compliance regulations simpler just for training purposes. Emily said I was using technical jargon to make her feel stupid. Federal compliance regulations was technical jargon that needed to be simplified. Sterling said perhaps we needed to adjust our approach. Maybe focus on high-level management instead of technical details. I pointed out that high-level management of a database required understanding technical details. He asked if it really did. He said he didn't understand technical details and had been running the company for 15 years. I reminded him that he had been running the business side. The technical side had been running itself because the systems I built were robust and stable. Emily snorted and said systems couldn't run themselves. Actually, well-designed systems could run themselves for extended periods with minimal human intervention. That was the entire point of good architecture. Sterling said they appreciated everything I had built, but they needed to think about the future. Emily brought fresh ideas and modern perspectives. Maybe it was time to consider new approaches to a system that processed $2.3 billion in daily transactions without errors. The final meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Management called it a transition celebration. Cake in the break room, speeches about new beginnings, handshakes all around. I spent Thursday night at home, working on the laptop I had bought, not planning anything dramatic, just making sure I understood exactly how my own systems worked and what would happen if certain protocols were activated. The emergency procedures I had built were elegant in their simplicity. If someone without proper biometric authorization attempted to modify core database structures, the system would interpret their actions as a hostile takeover attempt. In response, it would implement total asset protection, transferring all stored funds to protected federal accounts rather than allowing them to fall into unauthorized hands. The trigger mechanism was biometric authentication combined with behavioral analysis. My fingerprint, scanned every morning when I logged in, established my identity as the authorized administrator. If someone else tried to access core functions or attempted changes outside normal operational parameters, the protection protocols would activate automatically. Originally, I had planned to disable those protocols before leaving, but that was before I found out they had been planning to eliminate me for months. Friday morning arrived gray and humid. I dressed carefully. My best shirt, the tie my father had given me for college graduation. If this was going to be my last day at Sterling Financial, I wanted to look professional. The morning passed quietly. I organized my desk, backed up personal files, deleted my browser history. At 11, I walked to the server room for one final system check. Everything looked perfect. $1.2 billion worth of financial data, organized and protected by systems I had spent 12 years perfecting. I ran my biometric scan one last time, fingerprint recognition confirming my identity as the authorized administrator. All systems showed green. The celebration started at 2. Sterling made a speech about exciting new directions and fresh perspectives. Emily talked about her vision for modernizing our technological approach. Michael presented me with a plaque thanking me for my years of dedicated service. Nobody mentioned that they had been planning to fire me for months. At 3:30, Sterling called me into his office for our final conversation. He said this was difficult for everyone, but they thought it was time for me to move on to new challenges. I said I understood. He said they would provide excellent references and were prepared to offer a generous severance package, 6 weeks of salary, for 12 years of perfect service. I said that was very kind. Emily was already sitting in my chair when we walked back to my office. She was logged into my computer, clicking through system menus with the confidence of someone who had no idea what she was looking at. She said brightly that she thought she was getting the hang of everything. The system seemed pretty straightforward once you understood the basic principles. I smiled and said I was sure she would do great. I cleaned out my desk drawers. A few personal photos, some technical books, the coffee mug my nephew had given me for Christmas. I shook hands with my former colleagues and accepted their awkward condolences. At 4:45, I walked to my car. At 5 o'clock, Emily would attempt to modify core database settings to implement her modernization ideas. At 5:01, the system would detect an unauthorized modification attempt. At 5:02, total asset protection protocols would activate automatically. I drove home and waited for my phone to ring. The call came at 5:23. I was sitting on my back porch, drinking a beer and watching the sunset, when my phone buzzed with Michael Thornton's name on the screen. He said they had a situation. What kind of situation? I asked calmly. The system was down. Everything. The entire database platform had just gone offline without warning. I took a slow sip of beer. That was strange, I said. Had they checked the error logs? He said they couldn't access anything. It was like the whole system had vanished. All the data, client files, transaction records, backup systems, everything showed as transferred or missing. I could hear panic in his voice and chaos in the background. Other voices shouting, urgent conversations, the sound of people who suddenly realized they were in serious trouble. I asked if they had tried the emergency recovery protocols. He said they couldn't find them. Emily had been trying to update some security settings and then everything just disappeared. Security settings, I said. Of course. The backup systems were showing the same status, he said. All assets had been automatically transferred to federal protective custody. $1.2 billion worth of client data had moved to secured government accounts. Their clients were already calling. They needed me to come in immediately and fix whatever had gone wrong. I finished my beer slowly and said I was sorry, but I didn't work there anymore. Remember? I was transitioned out this afternoon. He said I had built these systems. I was the only one who understood how they worked. I said I had documented everything thoroughly. Didn't Emily mention that during the knowledge transfer sessions? Long silence. Then he said they really needed my help. This was an emergency that could destroy the company. I said I wished I could help, but without authorized access credentials there was nothing I could do. And since I was no longer an employee, I couldn't legally access company systems even if I wanted to help. I hung up. It rang again immediately. Sterling this time, his voice tight with panic. He said we needed to talk right away. I told him I was enjoying my retirement and wasn't available for consulting work. He started shouting about how I had sabotaged the company, how I would face criminal charges. I calmly explained that the system had simply detected unauthorized access and protected itself exactly as designed. If Emily had proper authorization and training, none of this would have happened. He hung up on me. Over the next hour, my phone rang constantly. First Michael again, then Emily crying and screaming that I had to fix this, then various executives I barely knew, all demanding that I return immediately to restore the system. I turned off my phone and went inside to make dinner. By 8 o'clock, local news stations were reporting on a major technology failure at Sterling Financial Solutions. By 9, it had made national news. By 10, federal banking regulators were issuing statements about protecting client assets during the investigation. I watched it all unfold from my living room, eating leftover pizza and drinking another beer. The news anchors kept using words like catastrophic and unprecedented to describe what had happened. They interviewed financial experts who called it the worst database failure in modern banking history. But the real entertainment started the next morning. Saturday brought news that Sterling Financial's board of directors had called an emergency meeting. Sterling himself was reportedly locked in his office, screaming at lawyers and IT consultants who had no idea how to restore a system they didn't understand. Emily had been taken to the hospital for what news reports called exhaustion and stress-related symptoms. Michael Thornton was spotted at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, apparently trying to flee to a non-extradition country before federal investigators froze his assets. By Sunday, 3 more Sterling Financial executives had been arrested. The FBI had discovered that the company had been operating with massive security vulnerabilities for months, violating numerous federal banking regulations. The board voted unanimously to remove Sterling as CEO and began discussions about filing for bankruptcy protection. Monday morning brought the news I had been waiting for. Sterling Financial Solutions was officially filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. All company assets would be liquidated to pay creditors and legal settlements. Client funds remained secured in federal accounts pending resolution of multiple investigations. But the personal consequences were just beginning to unfold. By Tuesday, I learned that Robert Sterling had been arrested on charges of fiduciary negligence and reckless endangerment of client assets. The FBI had found emails showing he knew about the risks of replacing me, but proceeded anyway to save money. Federal prosecutors were seeking a 10-year prison sentence and complete forfeiture of his personal assets. The Sterling family mansion in Highland Park was seized by federal marshals. His yacht, his art collection, his vacation home in Aspen, all of it frozen pending criminal proceedings. His wife filed for divorce and moved back to her mother's house in Louisiana, taking their younger children with her. Michael Thornton was also facing federal charges for his role in the conspiracy. His Goldman Sachs background didn't protect him from fraud allegations when investigators discovered he had been paid consulting fees by Meridian Global, while secretly funneling them inside information about our systems. His legal bills bankrupted him within weeks. His Manhattan apartment was foreclosed on. His ex-wife took full custody of their children and moved to California. Emily Sterling fared the worst of all. Despite her Harvard degree and family connections, no financial firm would hire her after news broke about her role in the catastrophe. She had been personally named in 17 different lawsuits from pension funds and hospitals seeking damages for her gross negligence. Her trust fund was frozen pending litigation. The Mercedes her father had bought her was repossessed. She was working at a Starbucks in Arlington, living with her mother in a 2-bedroom rental apartment, trying to pay for community college courses to learn basic computer skills. I drove by that Starbucks one morning, curious to see how she was adapting to regular employment. Through the window, I could see her struggling with the cash register, obviously overwhelmed by technology far simpler than the billion-dollar database she had tried to modernize. A customer was yelling at her about his coffee order. She was crying. I ordered a large coffee, black, and left a $50 tip. She didn't recognize me. The teachers who had trusted us with their pensions eventually got their money back from the federal insurance program, but it took 8 months and caused real hardship for families who had been counting on those payments. Retired educators who had worked for 30 years found themselves taking part-time jobs at grocery stores and restaurants to pay their bills, while bureaucrats processed their claims. The Children's Hope Cancer Center had to delay construction of their new wing by 2 years while fighting to recover their endowment through the courts. Children with cancer continued receiving treatment in overcrowded, outdated facilities because Emily Sterling had thought a billion-dollar financial system was like Excel. But justice moved slowly through the federal court system, and I wasn't content to wait for bureaucrats to deliver consequences. I had kept detailed records of every email, every document, every conversation that had led to my termination. I packaged it all up and sent copies to investigative journalists at the Wall Street Journal, the Dallas Morning News, and 60 Minutes. The first major expose ran 6 weeks after the collapse. The $1.20 billion mistake, how nepotism and greed destroyed Sterling Financial, became the most read article in the Wall Street Journal's online history. It detailed exactly how Sterling had planned to replace experienced engineers with his unqualified daughter to save money on salaries. The article included excerpts from the PowerPoint presentation I had discovered, showing in stark detail how management had deliberately ignored technical expertise in favor of cost-cutting. It quoted from emails where Sterling called me a single point of failure that needed to be eliminated for operational efficiency. Most damaging of all, it revealed that Sterling had known about potential risks, but proceeded with the transition anyway because he was more concerned with quarterly profit margins than client safety. The 60 Minutes segment aired 2 months later. They interviewed me extensively, giving me a platform to explain exactly what had happened and why. I showed them the technical documentation proving that Sanctuary had worked exactly as designed, protecting client assets from unauthorized access. But I also showed them emails proving that Sterling's team had deliberately circumvented security protocols and ignored my warnings about the risks of their transition plan. I explained how Michael Thornton had been secretly working with outside consultants to replace our entire technical infrastructure with cheaper, less secure alternatives. The segment included interviews with affected clients, teachers who had lost access to their pensions, hospital administrators who couldn't fund critical medical equipment, veterans whose disability benefits had been frozen for months. They all told the same story. They had trusted Sterling Financial with their most important assets, and corporate greed had betrayed that trust. Public opinion turned decisively against Sterling and his team. Death threats forced them into hiding. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse during Sterling's arraignment, holding signs that read, "Jail the greedy banker," and "Justice for pensioners." Sterling's legal team tried to negotiate a plea deal, but federal prosecutors weren't interested in mercy. They wanted to make an example of a CEO who had gambled with client assets to increase his own profits. The trial was scheduled for the following spring, with cameras allowed in the courtroom. Emily Sterling's situation grew even worse as media attention intensified. Someone leaked her employment records from Starbucks, showing that she had been written up multiple times for poor performance and had been demoted from shift supervisor back to basic barista. A video of her crying during a particularly busy morning rush went viral on social media. She tried to disappear from public view, but reporters tracked her down everywhere she went. Her community college dropped her from classes after other students complained about the disruption caused by media attention. She ended up moving to a small town in East Texas, working at a gas station convenience store under an assumed name. Michael Thornton's downfall was equally complete. His fraud trial began before Sterling's, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Federal investigators had traced payments from Meridian Global back to offshore accounts he controlled. They had recordings of phone calls where he discussed selling Sterling Financial's technical secrets to competitors. He was convicted on 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and corporate espionage. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $45 million in restitution, money he didn't have. His ex-wife publicly celebrated the verdict, telling reporters that she hoped he would rot in prison for what he did to innocent families. As for me, I started my new job at SecureNet Consulting in Austin exactly 1 month after Sterling Financial collapsed. Triple salary, full benefits, stock options, 5-year contract. They had recruited me after reading about the case in industry publications, impressed by my ability to build unbreakable security systems. The federal investigators eventually figured out exactly what had happened. They called my security protocols the most sophisticated asset protection system ever implemented in commercial software. The FBI wanted to hire me to design similar systems for protecting government databases from insider threats.